Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 260, can you believe? Anyway, this week we have, of course, questions, and they're taken from Guide 318 and 319, that's the guide to HMS Argus, and the salvage ship Comuna, and the Wednesday videos on 5 vessels that deserve to be better known, the obscure ships, and the Admiral Beresford and the 2nd Pacific Squadron, what if the Royal Navy had actually gone to war over the Dogger Bank incident, with a guest question from the book recommendation video on the Imperial German Navy. So let's begin. Robert Mills asks, I think the proposed 1919 raid on the German High Seas Fleet by air would be a great candidate for one of your What If Wargame videos. Any chance of seeing that at some point? Yes, it is definitely something I want to cover at some point in the future. I've got plenty of information on the planning for it and how the Royal Navy envisaged it going, and lots of background info on how the idea came about. But the actual execution, of course, it didn't happen, and if it did happen, as you say, you have to wargame it out. Unfortunately, the vast majority of wargaming systems for the World War I period don't have torpedo bomber rules in them for a very good reason, namely that they basically weren't torpedo bombers in the First World War. I mean, technically, yes, there were a few, but not really enough that anyone's ever bothered writing them into any game system that I've seen with any great amount of detail. And the other two issues is finding out, one, what the High Seas Fleet's nighttime action stations - procedures and policies were for when they were in harbour, which is slightly harder to find than you might otherwise imagine. And also what, if any, anti-aircraft defences Wilhelmshaven had. Finding the anti-torpedo defences, that's easy enough, but the anti-aircraft defences, they basically appear to be slim to none. But I want to make absolutely 100% sure of, down to the very last gun, because of course there are some anti-aircraft guns on the ships. I mean, not that it's going to make a huge amount of difference, but unfortunately it is one of those things of if you miss a very slight detail, even if it wouldn't really make a huge amount of difference, people will cry about it, because there's a small but vocal minority of people, as I've covered before, who really don't like the Germans losing anything. Now, admittedly, most of them tend to focus more on World War II Germany, but World War I Germany can also be a little contentious. And to be perfectly fair, it's also a matter of historical accuracy. You don't want to be going off saying, well, Wilhelmshaven doesn't have any anti-aircraft defences, when in fact it does. There were a few AA defences, but, the practical effect of them is likely to be, as I said, slim to none, but you've got to make sure that you are talking everything accurately down to the smallest detail. And then you've got to simulate, the torpedo bomber runs, how many successful launches are there going to be, how many hits, what effect are those hits going to have, do you randomize, how do you randomize all of that, and then assess. It's going to be a big number crunching exercise, but it definitely is something that's going to be fun to do. The other thing is that, because of course it didn't happen, and a lot of the systems that were going to be used for it, including the Cuckoo itself, the torpedo bomber, didn't really get much use in the post-war period. It means that I'm going to have to look into getting some kind of computer graphics done for some of it, because there's not a very, very high-level photo of the High Seas Fleet of Wilhelmshaven circa 1918, 1919 to show you where all the ships would have been. That's going to have to be a computer-generated map. There's 2 or 3 photos of the Cuckoo, so with that and the formation with all the sort of hodgepodge of carriers, etc., that's all going to have to probably be CGI'd as well. So, one for the long road, I think. Edward Dunn asks, why did most nations end up settling on very similar gun sizes for ships in the pre-dreadnought era? Battleships tended to have a mix of a few roughly 12-inch guns and something between 5.5 and 6.5-inch guns as the secondary battery, with similar comparisons able to be made in cruisers. The best reason I can think of is technological limitations in gun development and performance, but are there any other causes that you know of? With the main guns, it comes down mostly to technological limitations, but not of the guns, but of the fire control equipment. Because, of course, you'd seen a race up and up and up and up in gun caliber in the 1870s and the 1880s, but then there'd been something of a revolution in metallurgy and propellants, which allowed you to have longer barrel guns, and therefore, crudely speaking, but as a result, the shells had been able to travel faster, which meant they'd been able to hit harder, which meant that a smaller caliber than, say, a 16.5 or a 17.7 inch could penetrate just as much, if not more, armour. And that tended to be, as you said, around about 12 inch, basically 11 to 13 inch, with most people settling on 12, with the occasional outlier like the Germans trying for 9.4 inch at one point. But essentially, for the pre-dreadnoughts, for most of the pre-dreadnought era, they didn't have the rangefinders and the fire control equipment to allow them to hit much beyond a few thousand yards, at which point the 12-inch-ish gun was perfectly adequate. There was very little point in making a larger weapon, because a larger weapon would go through armour just as well. There wasn't any particularly major advantage in armour penetration beyond we've gotten through. And the bigger gun would fire slower, it would take up more weight, and that would take away from potential protection or other batteries. So that limited gun size. And then, of course, once you get rangefinders and fire control equipment starting to come in the 1900s, then you still have the size limitations on the ships. Governments don't want to suddenly spend massive amounts more on significantly larger vessels, so you start to see developments in secondary and tertiary batteries, and the going from 40 to, say, 45 caliber guns for the main battery, and so on and so forth. And it's only once the ranges really start to open out in the latter part of the 1900s, as the Dreadnought era kicks off, that the ranges at which you might hit become meaningful enough that actually you can armour a ship in combat ranges against 12-inch gunfire, at which point you start to see the main guns caliber suddenly start to rise very quickly for the most part, or the occasional long barrel 50 or longer caliber 12-inch gun. With the secondary batteries, most of it is related to two things, one of which is rate of fire. They'd introduced quick firing 6-inch in the 1890s, but extending that technology up to higher calibers took a little bit longer to do. So if you could have a 7 or 8-inch secondary, or 7.5-inch secondary, or a 9.2-inch secondary, or a 10-inch secondary, which later pre-dreadnoughts did, but you were making significant sacrifices in the rate of fire, and you tended to see, once those batteries came into place, that the tertiary battery also expanded in size to roughly the 5.5 to 6.5-inch range, give or take a bit. The other factor, which is partly tied into rate of fire, partly tied into the fact that the secondary batteries generally are casement mounts, and that's why when you see the bigger 7, 8, 9.2 inch, etc., you start to see them in turrets, is that the casement mounting requires a lot more manual handling than the mechanical systems of a turret, and that puts a hard limit on A, what people can physically carry, and B, what people can repeatedly physically carry. And it turns out that approximately a 6-inch shell, give or take, with its charges, is about as much as people can handle. And that's kind of a universal thing of the human body. You can slightly lighten it to give yourself a slightly increased rate of fire at the expense of slightly reduced firepower per shot, or you can push it up very slightly, but you are talking really the upper limit of what people can rapidly and repeatedly handle. A 6-inch gun of the pre-dreadnought period, you're looking at a shell weight of 40 to 45 kilos, 90 to 100 pounds. That's more than twice what the recommended single-person carry weight limit is for modern working. Obviously, health and safety was not so much of a thing back then, but there are physical limits to what people can do. And, if you think about a 100 roughly 100-pound weight, yeah, most fit, strong, healthy young adults can probably easily, or within reason, pick up and carry around 100-pound weight. But for how long can you do it, and how many times can you repeatedly pick up and maneuver that thing at speed? That's a slightly different matter. Connor McHugh asks, what were the ways the British would supply planes to Malta and the Mediterranean, and what are the approximate percentages of each method? I'm curious to see how much Argus contributed to this role in comparison with other ways. So there were 3 primary and 1 short-lived secondary way that the British got aircraft to Malta. The first way was actually the secondary, very short-term way, and that was an attempt to fly aircraft over Africa from British-held air bases in West Africa, and basically fly over the northern portion of Africa over the Mediterranean to Malta. That they stopped pretty quickly, because it turned out that although it was theoretically possible to stuff an aircraft full of fuel and stick some external fuel tanks on so it had the range, getting pilots who could navigate over the rather empty wastes of parts of large areas of North Africa and then out over the sea all the way to Malta was somewhat more difficult, and a disturbing number of aircraft just vanished. So that stopped very, very quickly. That then led to the first of the 3 main ways, which were the ferry runs, sometimes called the club runs. And in this, Ark Royal, Eagle, and Furious were the most prevalent. Argus flew aircraft over to Malta using this method 4 times, mostly flying off Hurricanes, and the others did considerably more missions than that. Wasp did a couple of club runs as well, USS Wasp. Now, that can be a little bit deceptive because, of course, the carriers had to sail with escorts. So the club run total up how many aircraft flew from a given carrier. They don't necessarily total up the number of times a vessel would have gone out as an escort to the vessels that were doing this. So Argus's contribution wasn't necessarily always just directly launching aircraft to Malta. Sometimes her contribution was providing the aerial escort for the carrier that was flying aircraft off to Malta. And then you have the third way, or second primary way, which was something that Argus featured in much, much more heavily, which was during the winter periods. They would ferry, Furious and Argus, that is, would ferry aircraft down to West Africa again, because by the time the second winter rolled around, the Allies had made advances such that they actually held airfields in North Africa. And therefore, obviously, they could put homing beacons and scouting aircraft and all sorts of things like that up. And so instead of launching the aircraft from the carriers to the West African airfields and straight to Malta, which had not worked previously, now the carriers would launch their aircraft. They would either land in West Africa or sometimes just be craned onto the shore and taken physically to the airfield. Then they'd be fueled up, tropicalized, and flown across North Africa to North African airfields held by the Allies, and they'd land, refuel, rearm, etc., and then head over to Malta. And of course, because that's not directly launching aircraft to Malta, that's usually not, well, it's not tabulated in the club runs because they're not club runs, but it's usually not very well tabulated in many places elsewhere. And then once you got aircraft with longer ranges, then it got to a stage where you could just stage aircraft straight out of Gibraltar, which was relatively easy at that point, relatively speaking, because you'd put a bunch of internal fuel on the aircraft, obviously fill up all their internal fuel tanks, maybe add 1 or 2 additional tanks. These aircraft were also usually disarmed or mostly disarmed, and guns and ammunition and so forth were sent to Malta by ship. And they would also carry a bunch of external fuel tanks, and with that they could make the roughly 1,100-mile trip to Malta, and that was much easier than navigating over North Africa, because essentially all you had to do was fly high, make sure you kept the North African coast vaguely on your right, and doodle along, and then you got to the point where you took a left turn to get to Malta, and that was that. And obviously Argus didn't have too much to do with that, although she was occasionally involved in shuttle runs from the UK to Gibraltar, much in the same way that she had been involved in aircraft shuttle runs from the UK to West Africa, delivering aircraft which would then make this trip. The man formerly known as Commenting Is What I Do asks, of the three classes, Queen Elizabeth, Hood and the Bismarcks, which one would benefit the most if they were designed with triple turrets instead of twin turrets, without any other major design changes and keeping the overall number of turrets? It's a little difficult to judge, to be honest, because if you're going to put in each of these cases, if you said design with triple turrets, i.e. usually 3 turrets instead of 4, that would have been a much easier question to answer in terms of who would have benefited the most. But if you want to keep the number of turrets the same, i.e. they're all going from 8 gunships to 12 gunships, without any other major design changes, that becomes a very difficult factor, because you might think, well, look at Bismarck, for example. You might think, okay, Bismarck might do better with 50% more firepower. Okay, sure, that's a decent argument to make. However, if you are going to stick another 4 guns on Bismarck and expand the turrets and the barbettes and the magazines, etc., to compensate, and you're not making any other major design changes, that's going to be a slower ship. You're probably going to go down to about 28 knots. At which point, with Bismarck's speed advantage gone, she's much easier to track down. Potentially may not even need the swordfish hit from Ark Royal to actually slow her down even more, because remember, she was, assuming Battle of Denmark Strait goes the same, she would have been hit in the bows still by Prince of Wales, so her speed would have dropped anyway, except it would have dropped proportionally more, which might have been enough that the rudder hit wasn't necessary. So that's actually worse for Bismarck. The other thing is also, if Bismarck is 28 knots instead of her actual speed, because of this additional weight with no additional changes, then potentially she isn't going to manage to break contact with Norfolk and Suffolk the way she did the night before, which means Norfolk and Suffolk might be able to guide Holland in to make his attack at night the way he wanted to, which means Bismarck's career might end at the Battle of the Denmark Strait, because it will be happening 12 hours earlier at night, with Bismarck being subjected to close-range fire from Hood, Prince of Wales, and torpedo attacks from the various destroyers, which is a situation that's a lot more even and actually has a significant advantage for the British. At Hood with triple turret, Bismarck with triple turrets might actually end up worse for the Germans. Queen Elizabeth with triples likewise is going to be slower, which means that, for Jutland it could make some interesting implications, because if the Queen Elizabeths with triples, again, assuming roughly speaking, when you look at these kind of designs, they usually lose about 2 knots. So they're 22-ish and the 22 to 23 knot ships at this point. Well, now they're no longer significantly faster than the rest of the battle line. They are just generic battle line units. So would 3rd Battle Cruiser Squadron be sent off to train at Scapa and leave Beatty with just 1st and 2nd Battle Cruiser Squadrons? Possibly not. In fact, most likely not. At which point, Beatty sails for Jutland with 1st through 3rd Battle Cruiser Squadrons. Now, of course, Invincible proved 3rd Battle Cruiser Squadron would be quite vulnerable to going boom, but it's potentially slightly more likely that 3rd Battle Cruiser Squadron, because they were familiar with BT's signalling, or lack thereof, might have been able to stick with his fleet, so you might still have had a dramatically outnumbered German battle line, which might have ended worse for the Germans. And then, obviously, the Queen Elizabeth would have done a bit more damage in the confrontation with the High Seas Fleet, but probably not hugely greater. Beatty's force probably would have suffered more casualties on the run to the north, because, well, if the Invincible's in out the tail end of his fleet, and, they're not going to withstand the same kind of battering that Barham and Warspite did, let's just put it that way. And then when you get into the Second World War, it's going to be much harder. Although they would have obviously considerable amount of firepower, it's going to be much harder to modernise them to a useful speed, because when they were modernised originally, they had upgrades in anti-aircraft firepower, upgrades in armour, upgrades to their gun turrets, and with the modernised machinery that was able to keep their speed in a slightly more compact environment, then their overall speed was still useful, for the modernised units at least. Whereas if you're starting off from a base speed of 22 to 23 knots, to get a useful speed, you're either going to have to leave out some of the upgrades, or you're going to have to, accept the fact that you're still going 22, 23 knots, which is not as useful as 24.5, 25 knots, which will limit the overall capabilities of the Queen Elizabeth. Of course, where there could be one way to do that and still maintain a decent amount of firepower, which would be a modernised Queen Elizabeth loses Y turret, the superfiring aft turret, which will still leave them with 9 guns, which is still a very respectable broadside, and that might buy them the weight to buy speed and all the other upgrades, but, a little questionable on that. But Hood, the only reason I would say Hood marginally would benefit is, well, more guns better, obviously. But for Hood, we actually do have quite a bit of detail on an alternative design that was being considered whilst Hood was being developed, that actually did have 4 triples, which I've vaguely kit bashed together in Ultimate Admiral Dreadnoughts here, you can see on the screen. And that was basically, which is why I've been saying you roughly lose 2 knots, because of Hood, as we know, launching with 8 guns was 32 and a bit knots design speed, whereas the theoretical 4 triple turret version, same hull, same protection, same engine power, etc., it drops from design knot speed of just over 32 knots to design speed of just over 30 knots. Now, the reason I think Hood would have benefited the most is because dropping from 32 to just over 30 knots doesn't manifestly affect her ability to chase down most things, apart from maybe some of the faster cruisers, especially given the fact that by the time she gets to her older age, she's going to have lost a knot or 2 still, and she's still going to be a useful fast ship. But of course, she now has 50% more firepower, more chances to hit, etc., etc. So, I think the thing is, the weakness of the design without any major design changes is the loss of speed. But because Hood has the highest speed to start with, and she still retains a pretty quick speed by going up to 4 triples instead of 4 twins, she loses the least out of all of them. Scott Mason asks, why did the Germans tell everyone the Bismarcks were Washington and London Treaty compliant, even though they were not part of either? Was it just to try and put the British at ease? I feel like they could have just said they were 40,000 tons and nobody could have legally said or done anything about it. Well, there's 2 things to consider. Basically, you could call it tactical and strategic. On a tactical level, although it's a bit of a misnomer, but you'll see what I'm getting at in a minute. If you say your ship is 35,000 tons and has 8 15-inch guns, then the people who are designing ships to counter you, assuming that they believe you, will probably go for it. And if they do go for it, then they're going to design a ship that is going to counter a ship that has all the limitations of a ship that carries that armament on that tonnage. If you've got another 5, 6, 7,000 tons to play with, you can stick a bunch more additional stuff in that ship, whether that be more armor, more secondary firepower, other systems, higher speed, etc., that your opponent won't expect. And so, that's an advantage for you straight off. The other thing, the sort of, if you like, the strategic, the higher level issue, is that actually something, this is kind of a common misconception. Yes, the Germans did not sign up to the Washington or London treaties directly, but at the time they laid down Bismarck, they were subject to the Anglo-German Naval Agreement, and the Anglo-German Naval Agreement did commit them to building to the same limits in terms of per ship design as everybody else. So they were actually legally bound to design 35,000-ton capital ships, just not specifically because they were signed up to the London Naval Treaty, but because they were signed up to the Anglo-German Naval Agreement. particularly look at sections 2D and 2G of the Anglo-German Naval Treaty, where not only does the German government say that they are in favour with the limitation of naval armaments, at that point the London Treaty that's in force, but they also specifically go on to talk about in fairly great detail the fact that the Royal Navy's tonnage allowances in battleships, carriers, cruisers, etc., divided or into 35%, which is what they agreed to in everything but submarines. They specifically make a point that this may not be a nice round even number in terms of number of ships, and therefore they reserve the right to make minor adjustments to exact tonnage figures for specific categories. Now, if they weren't bound by 10,000 ton for cruiser, 35,000 ton for battleship, etc. limits, that is an entirely irrelevant bunch of text. So if you look at, say, heavy cruisers, cruisers with guns more than 6.1 inches, the British allocation under the London Naval Treaty is 146,800 tons. You multiply that by 35%, you get 51,380 tons. Now, if the Germans aren't limited to treaty restrictions per ship, well, then this doesn't matter. You can build 4 ships at 10,000 tons and a 5th ship at 11,380 tons. Or if we look at battleships, if you divide the British allocation into, multiply by 1.35 to get you 35%, that gives you 183,750 tons. Divide that through by 35,000 tons per ship, that gives you 5.25 capital ships at 35,000 tons. Again, if Germany is not subject to any limits, there's no point in talking about playing slightly with the ratios, because you could just build 4 35,000 ton battleships and then another battleship that's closer to 40,000 or actually just over. But they don't. They're constantly going on about making these slight adjustments. And so what you would actually end up doing, because they are subject to these limitations, is where you've got, as we covered earlier, just over 1,000 tons spare in your cruisers, you might then say, if you were sticking to the limit, okay, well, we're going to reduce our battleship tonnage to 5 capital ships at 35,000 tons. And then we're going to take the remaining 8,750 tons of what could have been our battleship allowance, we're going to slap that onto our cruiser allowance, and that actually allows us to build an additional, when combined with the slightly leftover cruiser tonnage allowance, that allows us to build an additional 10,000 ton cruiser. So our cruiser fleet is slightly over 35% the size of the British capital ship fleet, but the battleship fleet is slightly under. And that's in a good chunk of Section 2 of the treaty is all about. Rapid Rhino 3218 asks, are the 5-inch 38 turrets on US battleships, destroyers and cruisers and carriers all the same design and build? Would it make sense to use exactly the same turrets for all these ships to reduce the cost in manufacture, maintenance of spare parts and training, or are there slight differences to address each ship's type or mission profile? No, there's actually quite a surprising variety in the mountings for the 5-inch 38 caliber gun. I mean, obviously there's the singles and the twins, but beyond that, there's a number of different modifications. So in brief, you have what are called pedestal mounts and base ring mounts. And a pedestal mount is one that, well, amongst other things, doesn't have an integrated shell hoist system. So much like a number of other anti-aircraft guns of the Second World War, you would have ready-use lockers, and the shell supply would be somewhere that wasn't integrated with the mounting, and shells would have to be, and charges would have to be passed along from there either to the ready-use lockers or directly to the guns, but it's not part of the gun system itself. Whereas the base ring mounts do have shell hoists, so the shells would just pop up next to the gun at whatever angle of train you happen to be at. And you can get pedestal mounts which are single gun, but you don't get pedestal mounts which are twin, but you do get base ring mounts which are twin, but they're also single. So within the single gun mountings, they could either be with it or without an integral hoist, so pedestal or base ring, but the twin mountings, like you can see here on Wisconsin, they are always base ring mounts, so they always have their integrated hoist. And then within that, you also have open mountings or shielded mountings, and you have enclosed ones. So you can obviously you can have a gun that's completely exposed. So if you go and look at the sides of some of the preserved Essex class carriers like USS Hornet, you'll see there's a 5-inch 38 gun just happily sitting out there in the open. That is an open pedestal mount. If you look at some of the US destroyers, they have a mix of enclosed guns, partly shielded guns, and open guns. And then, of course, you have the more famous kind of rounded box turret for the singles, which you see on something like the Fletchers, and the famous slightly more angular, but still relatively boxy turret, which you see on things like the Gearings, the Summers, and, of course, the US battleships, and the Essexes as well, on up near the island. And then within all of those potential combinations, you also have various marks and mods of mountings. And that can be to do with things like how thick the material of the enclosing shield or gun house is, what additional fire control equipment is in there, etc., etc. The greatest variation, to be fair, is in the twin enclosed base ring mounts, which is basically what you're looking at in this picture, because with all the other mounts, while there is some variation in weight, it's not much. So the lightest open pedestal mount is just over 13 tons, and the heaviest is just over 14. The open base ring mounts, so the ones with the hoists, there's a Mark 30 and a Mark 37 version. They're within 600 kilos of each other. The enclosed ones, like you get on the Fletchers, there's a bit more variation there, 18.5 to just over 20 tons. But then you get to the enclosed twin base rings, which are the ones you see here with the hoists. And the absolute lightest you find on that is the Mark 22 Mod 0 at just a fraction over 34 tons. And that's the mount that you would find on the Porter and Summers classes, as opposed to the Summoner class, which is the World War II version. So those are your single-use, surface action only ones. And then the next heaviest, so the first dual-purpose mount of this type, is the Mark 38 Mod 0, which is about 43.5 tons. And that's the destroyer mounting you'll find in the Sumner and Gearing classes. And the absolute heaviest version is the Mark 28 Mod 2, which is just over 77 tons. And that is the mount you're looking at the moment, because that is the mounting type that's found on USS Iowa. And, of course, her sister ships. Wayne's World of SciTech asks, if the channel had been blockaded, do you think the 2nd Pacific Squadron could have made it north around the British Isles? In theory, taking the old Armada route could be done. You know, there's nothing about the Russian ships that means they are physically incapable of making that passage, albeit that given the luck of the 2nd Pacific Squadron, at least someone would have probably ended up crashing into Ireland. But it wouldn't be a wholesale wipeout like it was with the Spanish Armada, because, well, frankly, you know, they're much more modern ships, and they encountered some pretty vicious storms off the African coast as well, and they made it through that. The bigger problem that they're going to have, though, which might actually legitimately cause a number of shipwrecks or other serious issues, is fuel. Because, of course, the 2nd Pacific Squadron was expecting, and obviously did, go through the Channel, which is a considerably shorter route. And having come out of the strait between Denmark and Norway, heading down through the North Sea into the Dogger Bank incident, if they then, say, got to Dover and found, actually, the British aren't going to let us through, we're going to have to skedaddle all the way around, that means they're going to have to double back on themselves for quite a bit. And if you look at where they historically made their first port of call afterwards, that distance is actually, from their last fuel stop, further than the stated range of a Borodino-class battleship moving at a cruising speed of 10 knots. And there were periods during the voyage through the North Sea when they were moving faster than that, thus burning more fuel. And if they do run into storms going all the way around Scotland and Ireland, which, let's face it, at least at some point they're going to, they are going to need to obviously burn more fuel again to try and get past and deal with that, which is going to further reduce their range. And that's for the battleships, which tend to have more fuel than many others. Now, of course, they did originally sail with considerably more fuel, coal stacked on decks and so on and so forth, but there's only so far that can take them. And again, we're talking about a very optimistic situation because we're dealing with the big more modern battleships range. Some of the other ships have significantly less range, which means they're going to be left with a couple of rather difficult decisions, because if the channel is blockaded and the British aren't going to be supplying them with coal, then in theory, if they really dice with the British and hug the coastline of Britain as is most efficient to get round, they might, at least the Borodinos, just about have enough fuel to make it to Brest in France and hope that the French will sell them some coal. You could, in theory, resupply at sea a little bit with coal, but that is not a pleasant or easy task, especially not in the North Atlantic. And again, this is, scraping by for the Borodinos. So whilst, yes, in theory, seaworthiness-wise they could, in terms of actually making it, I don't think the fleet actually collectively has the fuel, even with the additional fuel they've carried on board. They would at some point have to stop within what at that point is the British Isles, because remember in 1903, 1904, 1905, the whole of Ireland is part of the British Isles. They're going to have to stop in at some British port or charter a lot of colliers from British ports to come out and help them, which is going to cause some issues. If the British are hostile enough to the Second Pacific Squadron to blockade the channel against them, I don't think they're going to be selling them any coal. And Jonas Schult asks, I've noticed lately that your videos are for some reason not popping up in my recommendations, and now I have to search for them. I've heard of this problem happening with other YouTube channels recently and was wondering if you've noticed anything on your end. Some of these channels have made videos about it, and it seems so weird that the algorithm would suddenly stop recommending them. Is this a problem anyone else has been having, or did I just get hit by YouTube? Now, this question is 5 months old, so 5 or 6 months old, and obviously referring to problems they've been having recently, so it's probably relating to problems they've been having 6 or 7 months ago. Now, I do have a little bit of a theory about this. It may sound a little bit conspiracy-ish, but hear me out. Now, granted, over the past 7 to 9 months, YouTube income for 99% of people who make a living from YouTube has plummeted dramatically. I suspect it's basically overall to do with the fact that the global economy isn't doing too well, therefore advertisers are spending less, therefore there's less advertising money to go around, and more people, as they've lost their jobs, have turned to YouTube. So actually there's more people splitting the ad revenue between them at a time that there's less ad revenue. So, there's that would account for the general downturn that everybody has seen. However, specifically me, in terms of viewership and the CPM-RPM rates, what you actually get paid, for me, those dropped rather dramatically kind of late September, early October, and stayed down. I didn't even get the Christmas bump. It's relatively open fact. YouTubers tend to do fairly well in November, December, because companies are advertising quite a lot in that period for obvious reasons, and then they do terribly in January, February because no one is advertising in those periods. It kind of evens out. And most people that I've spoken to are also on YouTube. They got a little Christmas bump, not as much as they used to, and then nothing. I didn't get any Christmas bump, just continually declining income until basically last month, when it started to pop back up again for very inexplicable reasons. The viewership has not gone up as much as you'd expect to justify the jump in income, the income basically going back to roughly where it was last year. And when I look through the analytics, the majority of the drop in viewership is fewer people getting recommended the videos. Now, why? And then the increase more recently is more people being recommended the videos. So why would YouTube not recommend my videos, and from the sounds of it, potentially even remove it from people who are previously getting recommended my videos for about half a year. Well, this is where the minor conspiracy thing comes in, because those of you who may remember, in late September, early October last year, something around that, one of my videos that had been up for about a year and a half got flagged for multiple different things. They basically took away almost all the monetization, which in and of itself is it happens occasionally because the bot is stupid and then you have to manually appeal it and it's all fine. But this time it was multiple different flags. So they flagged a video about riverine conflict in the American Civil War between various ironclad vessels. They flagged it for racism, for inciting violence, for extremely foul language, none of which appears on this channel generally, and specifically definitely doesn't appear in that video. So I said, no, hang on a minute, this is dumb. Manual review, please. The manual review magically was conducted in less time than it took my screen to refresh, so it definitely wasn't a manual review. I then went and appealed to somebody, or, well, more likely another bot on the YouTube chat interface that YouTube creators get access to. They insisted there's nothing to be done. The manual review team has said, no, that's it. And I said, well, okay, then show me where these very extreme accusations are in this video. And they couldn't. And I said, right, so that doesn't exist, does it? These things, and they admitted in the chat, no, well, none of the things that have been flagged against you are actually in the video. But since the review's been done, well, stuff you, we're keeping it as is. I was obviously a little bit annoyed by this, because if the review stands, then so do the accusations, which obviously would have a negative impact going forward on the channel. And so I put all of that on a community post, and I also put it on Twitter, which was rather more public, and basically said, look, YouTube, you're being a bunch of idiots. This is clearly nonsense. Magically, within a few hours of me doing that, the video, which supposedly had gone through final review and could not be changed, had been changed and monetization was back. But then, equally mysteriously, within days of that happening, my income halved, or more, actually went down by about 60%, and stayed that way, completely apropos of nothing, basically because the analytics said I wasn't getting recommended anywhere near as much. Now, did somebody in YouTube decide I'd embarrass them and punish me by putting me on some kind of recommendation blacklist for half a year? I can't prove it, but I'd love to see someone come up with some other explanation that proves otherwise. Dr. Irrelevant asks, how would the design of ships in antiquity, the classic age of sail and the age of steam, as well as the age of iron and steel, change if the world's seas and oceans were comprised of fresh water instead of salt water? Well, initially there would be a few minor changes, and the thing is, an entirely freshwater system would, where the oceans are freshwater as well as the rivers, would be very much a giveth on one hand, taketh away on the other scenario, because on the one hand, at least currently, the kind of fouling that you get in fresh water is much less than what you get in salt water. Most of the organisms, basically various shellfish and seaweed and so forth, all lives in salt water. If it's all seawater, then they wouldn't live there, and therefore you wouldn't have to worry so much about fouling, so ships could move quicker. More generally, you wouldn't have to invest necessarily so much in anti-fouling paint, or earlier than anti-fouling paint, copper plating or sacrificial wood layers or whatever, albeit that is based on the current ecosystem balance, whether or not some kind of other freshwater-based mussel or kelp or whatever would grow in an entirely freshwater environment, who knows. But on the other hand, whilst you're not going to have as much fouling, and therefore your boat is not going to be quite as vulnerable to things like shipworm, which obviously wouldn't exist at this stage, then on the other hand, freshwater is generally held to rot wooden ships a little bit faster, especially if it gets inside. So your ship as a whole would be rotting away a little bit quicker, but also not, from two different causes. So that would be a rather interesting one. Of course, supplying your ship would be a lot easier, because if you are in a freshwater environment at all times, then one of the major restrictions, of course, for ships, especially in antiquity, when you had lots of very active rowers, but even much later on, was your water supplies, up until the invention of distillation plants. If the sea that you're in is all freshwater, you can just take fresh water in from the sea. You obviously have to filter and purify it, but that's a much easier job to do when you're just talking about contaminated freshwater as opposed to seawater, before, as I said, the installation of distillation plants. On a very minor scale, salt water is slightly denser than fresh water, which would mean ship design would have to change to accommodate a little bit more internal volume and or lighter weight structures if you wanted ships to sail at approximately similar waterlines to historically, but that effect will be, relatively speaking, minor in the grand scheme of things. And as you get on to the age of steam and steel, when you had problems with galvanization or galvanic action, when they had differential metals like copper and iron in the water on the same ship's hull, well, as we said, you may not necessarily need your copper anti-fouling plates, but even if you did, or you had copper on there for some other reason, the galvanic action in water is going to be less severe, and most rusts and everything will be less severe in fresh water than they will be in salt water, albeit that it will still be an issue, just not quite as rapid of one. Ferrata Victrix asks, what aspects of naval warfare do you think naval wargames rules overlook or overemphasise, and what would your ideal wargames rules do with those aspects? I think if I was going to pick one for each, overlook would be visibility and overemphasise would be gunnery. And that's because one of the single biggest influences over how you maneuver your ships is what you know about what the enemy is doing. And as with almost all major battles, especially in the age of steam and steel, knowing what your enemy is doing is usually the thing that determines who wins the battle. You look at Jutland, how the formations met was entirely dependent on if they knew the enemy was in the area and what they thought the enemy was doing as a result of their scouting reports. And that's why in the time, mostly pre-COVID, when I was able to do large-scale war games with other people, we re-engineered the rules of the systems we were using to reflect that kind of fog of war scenario. The problem is, if you are sitting down with another person to play a tabletop naval wargame, having fog of war rules is really difficult to implement, because unless you physically put a barrier across the table, you're going to see where the enemy's models are and you are going to react accordingly. And that probably wouldn't happen until almost the last minute in actual engagements, which is somewhat unrealistic. Now, obviously, as I said, in the ideal wargames rules, you would have that represented, but you would need a very complex multi-man operation to do so, which is why I understand the vast majority of wargames don't really consider it all that much. It's much easier to model in computer games, obviously, but for tabletop wargames, not so much. And the overemphasis part is gunnery, because, again, if we look at historical situations, even in World War II, even with radar-directed fire control, you could have multiple salvos just flat-out miss. And the further back you go, so early World War II, when there's radar but not radar-controlled gunnery, and then World War I, when you've just about got fire control systems and director firing on the larger ships, and then even before that, in the pre-dreadnought period, we don't have any of that. You could have half a dozen or more salvos that go off without ever hitting anything before you score maybe one or two hits, and then you're off target again, and then half a dozen salvos later you get one or two more hits, and so on and so forth. But no one is going to be playing a tabletop war game where you have to literally sit there for 5 or 6 hours to determine whether or not you've killed a single enemy ship. Usually, in most tabletop naval war games, if you roll your dice to hit somebody and you hit nothing, unless it's a very, very niche scenario where you're expecting perhaps to not to do very well, you're usually going to be incredibly disappointed. And that is a very, very unrealistic example of what actual naval gunnery is like. But again, whilst representing realistic naval gunnery is better in an ideal wargame setting for simulating realistic results, for the reasons I just mentioned, I can understand why the vast majority of wargames would just assume that 9 times out of 10 you'll probably hit at least something with every dice roll, even if you're not necessarily going to do all that much. In fact, one of the slightly more abstract ways of pulling off a balance between the two is the old dystopian wars game system under Spartan games. The new system is slightly different with the new owners, but under the old system, ships had a damage rating and a critical rating, which increased with the size of the ship. So you could roll, you could hit, you could score many hits, but unless your number of hits exceeded that rating, you didn't do anything. So I think that was a good way of abstracting it, because it gave the people who were rolling the dice the feeling of, oh yeah, well, I hit you, I just wasn't able to actually do much damage, but you got that visceral satisfaction of, I did manage to get some hits, while still representing the fact that actually a number of salvos may not actually accomplish all that much against a target. Yokosuka Girls Marine High School training vessel Harakaze asks, something I've wondered about is the Japanese Navy's reaction to the mutiny after the Emperor decided to throw in the proverbial towel. Had any of them been recruited for the attempted coup, attempted to join, or just stayed out of what was clearly their enemies, the Imperial Japanese Navy, that being not the Allies, plan? For that matter, did any of the Japanese Navy officers or men just join in when they heard what was going on? So I'm not particularly well versed in the exact details and mechanics of the Japanese military, or a small portion of the Japanese military's attempts to overthrow Emperor Hirohito to prevent the surrender announcement going out. However, from what I have been able to gather, it seems that, well, this wasn't the first attempt to dethrone him, and most of the 20th century conspiracies to dethrone the emperor seem to have been hatched by the Imperial Japanese Army, which almost by default means the Japanese Navy wants nothing to do with it, because any coup that's led by the Japanese Army will ultimately and rather quickly be to the negative impact of the Japanese Navy. Plus, although obviously there were Japanese Navy officials within central government, Japanese Navy military assets for the most part were concentrated rather unsurprisingly on the coast and in ports, which rather limited their ability to do much about anything that was happening over in Tokyo anyway. And even within the Japanese army, the people who were trying to organise the coup seem to have been an extreme minority, given that most of them seem to have committed suicide when they tried to arrange the coup and then realised that even most of the rest of the Japanese army wasn't going to follow them. So apart from the whole Bushido system, it was probably quicker and easier to kill yourself at that stage rather than let the loyalist elements of the Japanese military get hold of you. Now, of course, we have heard about various Japanese soldiers who went to ground and refused to believe the surrender notice, but ultimately, if you are a single soldier or a small group of soldiers in an occupied country and you think, this radio broadcast is nonsense, it's much easier to secrete yourself away and hide, and much easier to persuade yourself or your small group that it is all a trick, as compared to, even on a destroyer where you still have several hundred men. Yeah, persuading all of them, or enough of them to force everybody else that actually the Emperor's broadcast was some kind of deception, especially when, of course, being on a ship, you've probably got much better radio equipment than random Japanese army soldiers out in the field anyway. Yeah, it's the whole structure of the Japanese Navy just makes it much, much less likely that anybody seriously went along with the idea of the coup if they knew about it at all, because, as I say, being Japanese army-led, the chances of them telling the Navy in the first place are pretty slim to none anyway. Daniel asks, in your opinion, how would Task Force 11-14 handle the Japanese 2nd Carrier Division during the Battle of Wake Island in late 1941, had Vice Admiral Pai received accurate intel on the lack of Japanese battleships and pressed the attack? Wake gave the Japanese decent losses in the first assault wave, and relief forces could have done more damage, but would the inexperienced US Navy have cost America tremendously? Well, there's a couple of things to bear in mind. Firstly, Task Force 11 was assigned, that's Lexington's task force, was assigned to conduct raids in the Marshall Islands as a diversion, and its target was over 800 miles away further to the south. So Task Force 11 is exceptionally unlikely to be involved in any battle with 2nd Carrier Division because its whole purpose is to draw Japanese forces away. Now, if Task Force 14, i.e. Saratoga's task force, goes in regardless of what the intel says, she does have a bit of a problem in that she is 1 carrier against 2, so even if you get a mutual kill, that still leaves the Japanese with an advantage, because obviously if they have Soryu and Hiryu and they lose 1, well, they've still got a carrier and the Americans have none, so the tactical battle is won. Additionally, Saratoga is considerably more vulnerable than usual at this point because she's carrying some additional aircraft, which are supposed to be put onto Wake Island, which makes everything a bit more crowded. She's also carrying massive amounts of additional ammunition for Wake Island, which potentially makes any hits that she would sustain far more deadly than they might otherwise be. And the Japanese have a fair number of recon assets up and about, so there is a decent chance that she would be spotted on her way in. Now, of course, there are potential scenarios here where things go much better for the US. For example, if for whatever reason the Japanese don't realize that Saratoga is due in and they decide we're going in anyway, Saratoga would have all the time in the world to launch every aircraft it possibly could once it hit optimal range. And given that Soryu and Hiryu are relatively lightly built carriers, it's possible if they get the jump on them that they might be able to cripple or destroy both carriers in one massive strike. More likely they'll get one and leave the other one scrambling, figuring out where the heck did all those aircraft come from, which might give Saratoga enough time to recover its aircraft and launch a second strike, which might take out the other carrier. Albeit, given that this is going to be a devastator torpedo bomber strike combined with obviously Wildcats, Buffaloes and Dauntlesses, you'd expect there to be some fairly significant USN casualties as well, especially in the second strike if there is one. But obviously, especially with early war US Navy carrier practice in terms of how quickly they can get aircraft up and away, if the Japanese in any way, shape or form get the idea that Saratoga is nearby before Saratoga launches her own strike, the Japanese can get a bigger strike thanks to their 2 carriers, away quicker thanks to their better carrier launch doctrine, at which point that's going to be a lot of trouble. Now, of course, if Saratoga somehow manages to slip past completely unnoticed and get all her supplies offloaded at Wake Island, that's an entirely different story, but that's much more of a land battle versus whatever the Japanese choose to bring along, rather than a naval engagement. Unless, of course, what would almost certainly happen if somehow they manage to pull things off up to that stage, which would be the Japanese spot Saratoga moored off of Wake Island and then launch a strike on her there, which probably wouldn't go very well. Rebel Skvirl asks, what did a typical World War II transatlantic convoy formation look like, and how did it try to maximise its defence against U-boat attacks? This varied quite considerably during World War II, depending in part upon the number of escorts available and also depending on the tactics that were being employed at the time, which was partially dictated by the number of escorts available, but also partially dictated by the technology available at the time and the tactics the U-boats were using. But the core convoy formation is pretty much what you see here. You would have multiple lines of merchant ships forming an approximate box or rectangle, as that minimised the overall surface area occupied by the merchant shipping. And then you would typically have the convoy commodore ship in the centre, somewhat forward of the middle. And you would have, as and when they implemented them, a rescue ship towards the back centre of the convoy, because that allowed it to move in to collect survivors from torpedo ships, which would generally be ahead of it. And then the escorts, in an ideal scenario, if you had enough escorts, at one point would form 2 kind of chevrons, so a much bigger chevron or wing shape formation ahead of the convoy. So you'd have a ship at the very point of the wing, or chevron shape, which would be corresponding to the center of the convoy, but further ahead, with 2 wings sweeping back either side, which would then extend past, out and beyond the convoy. And the idea of that is obviously submarines ideally need to get ahead of the convoy in order to then launch their attacks, so this is the area you want to sweep the most, because a submarine that managed to plot an absolute perfect intercept course and land itself directly abreast the convoy is extremely rare and will have a matter of minutes to get a decent attack off. And then you would also have a inverted chevron, so where the point aims backwards, a slightly smaller one covering the rear of the convoy. Albeit, again, this is one possible formation and covers a certain type of U-boat tactics, especially when U-boats were known for passing through the convoys and then trying to come up and catch up with the convoy from behind at night, which is why you need a slightly shorter chevron with slightly smaller numbers of ships, because you're just worried about submarines coming up directly behind you, essentially. The problem is that if you have the threat of air attack, then you want your convoy escorts closer in and in a perhaps more circular formation to defend the convoy from aerial assault. And if the U-boats are acting with a slightly greater independence, or if they're in a big wolf pack and they may be coming from all directions, then later on you'd see formations where the convoy escort would form 4, 5 or more individual groups, and they would position themselves in groups of escorts at various points. So you'd always have some kind of escort directly ahead of the convoy, whether that's a single ship, part of a chevron, or a collection of ships in a tight grouping. And typically in this scenario you might have a group to the aft and then another 2 groups out on the wings, roughly parallel with the lead ships of the convoy but much further out. So if you imagine if you took that front chevron and just scrunched all the ships towards the very extremities and the center, but then you might also have some hunting groups slightly further back along the sides of the convoy, ready to surge forward to either replace ships that had gone off to hunt U-boats or to do the hunting themselves. And of course, if there was surface raider possibility, whether that be an Admiral Hippoglass or the Scharnhorst or whatever, then the formation would change again, both in terms of makeup of the escorts and in their location to better repel a surface attack. So unfortunately, outside of the single box or rectangle that's the very core of the convoy, there isn't really a single fixed convoy formation for the escorts, because it will change on, every few months basis. Donovan Lawler asks, in one of your fleet problem videos, you said HMS Nelson stumbled on one of the fleet problem exercises and decided to observe. My question is, did other nations' capital units stumble upon and decide to observe, or were other nations' capital units ever invited to participate in some other nations' exercises during the period that the channel covers? Occasionally, various nations' ships would accidentally, or perhaps not so accidentally, stumble upon various other nations' fleet exercises in various ways, shapes and forms. After all, that's one of the hazards of operating a fleet exercise in the open ocean. Technically, anyone can show up and watch you. You don't technically have a right to tell them to go away. You can, of course, do so anyway on the basis of I have a lot of guns, and if you don't go away, I'll be very displeased, but that is a little bit of a bluff most of the time. The flip side is, of course, that if an enemy or potential enemy wants to observe your fleet exercises, they have to find where you are first, and then they have to keep up with you, which could be something of an issue because, once again, the ocean is very, very large. However, in terms of joint fleet exercises, at least in the period that the channel covers for the larger nations, normally this would not be the case because, well, in the interwar period, there were only 3 full-sized, top-tier fleets, and they were all at varying levels thinking of how they might fight each other, or at least fight on their own. There were no kind of fixed alliances in place the way that you might have had in the Cold War period, And so the Japanese were not going to invite the Americans or the British to come and look at their fleet exercises and perhaps discern their tactics, and vice versa across all the board. During World War I and World War II, obviously, Allied nations would exercise alongside each other quite consistently, because that's a good idea, good thing to do. Pre-World War I, observations of other fleet exercises were far more common, because pre-World War I and certainly pre-Anglo-German naval arms race, so very beginning of the 20th century and then stretching back into the 19th century, fleet exercises were kind of like many of the early US Navy fleet problems, just as much about pomp and ceremony and showing off as they were about practical fleet lessons. And so hordes of observers from various foreign nations as well as civilians would show up in their various craft. Also, these exercises tended to take place either closer to shore or in more confined waters, so they were somewhat easier to find. You would, of course, sometimes have foreign naval observers from Allied nations aboard at various exercises. So during the Anglo-Japanese alliance, Japanese officers would observe British exercises and British officers would observe Japanese exercises from on board the ships that were undertaking those exercises. But generally speaking, across the time period, the channel covers actual joint exercises between different nations' fleets were incredibly rare outside of those fleets being allied during a period of actual war. And that brings us to the end of the last regular dry dock for the month of August. Thank you very much for listening, everyone. And next time you tune in on a Sunday, you will hopefully be listening to the next Patreon dry dock. So wish me good luck recording that thing.